Now, the first session of this year's G20 has concluded, and the draft communique says today's era must not be of war. In the opening remarks, Indonesian President Joko Widodo urged members to avoid another world war.
Being responsible here also means that we must end the war. If the war does not end, it will be difficult for the world to move forward. If the war does not end, it will be difficult for us to take responsibility for the future of current generation and future generations. We should not divide the world into parts. We must not allow the world fall into another Cold War.
Food and energy security has become the top priority. It's fallout of the war in Ukraine and also because of the plunge in the world economy. This is exactly what was discussed in the first session today. The group of 20, including Russia, deplored the economic impact of the Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, most members have condemned the war. Chinese President Xi Jinping warned the bloc against quote-unquote weaponization of food and energy. Countries that are not remotely involved in the war have also been facing the brunt. The July agreement to get Ukrainian grain moving again was a breakthrough. It helped poorer nations cope with food shortage around the world. Last month, it had hit a roadblock when Putin briefly walked away from the agreement. Even though the plan is now up and running, Western leaders will try to put a mechanism in place to deal with future roadblocks. Now, joining us for more on this is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal from Bali. Also, we're being joined by journalist Max Walden, who's joining us live from Melbourne, Australia. Thank you both of you for joining us. Siddhant, my first question to you. The first session has concluded on food and energy security. Prime Minister Modi also addressed the summit. What were the key takeaways here?
Well, several key takeaways, essentially first on the criticality of supply chains, pointing out disruptions because of climate change, COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Secondly, reiterating India's stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, saying that it should be solved diplomatically. And thirdly, perhaps one of the most important aspects has been on saying that the fertilizer crisis can lead to food crisis. That is an important message by the Indian Prime Minister. But of course, they were messaging as well in terms of the Russian price capping issue pushed by the West. He essentially said that restrictions should not be put in place when it comes to energy. We know that the Indian External Affairs Minister has been pointing out that India needs cheap energy given the country, the per capita income is very less. So a lot of outcomes from Prime Minister's first intervention here at the G20 Summit in Bali, Indonesia.
Right, absolutely, Siddhant. Thank you so much for getting us the latest on that. Max Walden, coming to you now. Australian Prime Minister to hold meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. This comes amid tense relations. What can we expect from this bilateral?
Well, it's difficult to know exactly what to expect, but of course, this is being described by the Australian government as a diplomatic success, particularly in the sense that, a high-level meeting between the leaders of the two countries has not occurred in 5 or 6 years. And we've seen, particularly through the COVID-19 pandemic, a real deterioration in the bilateral relationship. Of course, China being one of Australia's largest trading partner, but Beijing's imposed some $20 billion worth of tariffs on Australian goods. So certainly the Australian government's very keen to improve those ties. And I think really that will just be the focus of today's meeting. I'm not sure if we'll see majorly concrete outcomes from it, but certainly Australian officials are very keen to patch things up.
Right, absolutely. On that note, as I mentioned, the first session on energy and food security has concluded. So for Australia, what sort of resolutions do you think we can expect from world leaders here?
Well, again, as your introduction mentioned, of course, the real sticking point is the war in Ukraine. So, whilst, is Indonesian President Joko Widodo invited, of course, Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to speak at the B20, the Business Summit yesterday. Albanese really emphasised, the need to sort of collaborate on repairing the global economy, the G20 representing sort of 80% of the world's net output. And in terms of what we'd be looking to expect, I think particularly from Australia, the emphasis is on climate and the race towards net zero. So again, cooperation on things like food security might be difficult given that Russia is part of the G20, is participating in the forum, and divisions over, of course, the flow-on impacts on global food supply and food security due to the war. However, I think from Australia's perspective, certainly climate change and the emphasis on moving towards net zero, that will be a big emphasis in their diplomacy.
All right, Max Walden, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with all the latest on this.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.